We're going to be discussing the Islamic world, a discussion that began in my class, so we'll be finishing it here. However, it should be helpful to anybody who has taken an interest in or has to know the Islamic world for their history class. So before we get started, why don't you go ahead and pause me, take a look at that review wheel, and make sure that you can identify and describe the significance of all those key ideas. All right, so to begin, we're going to be talking about the last two pieces of the review wheel, the sects or the denominations that emerge out of a battle over succession after Muhammad dies, and the caliphates that emerge after that. Those sects have sort of sorted out their differences. So it's important to note that when Muhammad dies, it is unclear whether he names a successor. As a result, you get a struggle for power. Now, after him, the first caliph that emerges is a guy named Abu Bakr. And Abu Bakr is well known for stabilizing the empire after Muhammad dies. He standardizes the Quran, and he's very well known for sort of bringing the Islamic empire back under control. However, he dies shortly after taking power, and that leads to another battle over succession. Now, ultimately, what is going to happen is Ali is going to be the last of what Sunnis will call the first four rightly guided caliphs. Now, Ali happens to be Muhammad's son-in-law and cousin, and Shia Muslims believe that he should have been the first caliph, and Abu Bakr was illegitimate. So as a result of this divide over who should have succeeded Muhammad and who should be allowed to succeed Muhammad as caliph, you get a divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Sunni Muslims believe that anyone in the community of believers can succeed Muhammad as the caliph of the Islamic Empire, and Shia Muslims believe that it should be somebody who is related or a direct descendant of Muhammad. Now, nevertheless, you have this argument. However, after Ali finally dies in 661 due to assassination, Uthman's tribe, Uthman was the previous caliph, Uthman's tribe take over. Uthman's tribe is known as the Umayyads. Now, the Umayyads are going to be the first Islamic empire to take over after the first four rightly guided caliphs, and they're going to oversee a significant spread in the religion's influence, particularly in the Middle East, North Africa, and all the way into Spain. Eventually, the Umayyads are going to be overtaken by another Islamic entity known as the Abbasids. The Abbasids are well known for giving the Islamic world its golden age, moving the capital to Baghdad, and you really see the flourishing of Islamic culture under the Abbasids. However, keeping these two caliphates straight is going to be difficult, so let's take a moment to talk about their differences. The Abbasid Empire, the one that comes later, is actually located more in Southwest Asia and North Africa. However, the leaders of the Abbasid Empire come from further east. So if we were to look at a map, Abbasid rulers tend to come from modern-day Iran and Afghanistan, whereas Umayyad rulers tend to come from the Arabian Peninsula. So having said that, the Umayyad Empire's capital was in Damascus in modern-day Syria because it's closer to the Arabian Peninsula, whereas the Abbasids moved the capital eastward to where they were from. Now, despite their differences, both of these Islamic caliphates were Sunni Muslims. They were predominantly Arab, and they oversaw the spread of Islam, as you can see from this map here. So note, Islam spread very, very fast. So by the time the Abbasids are in power, Islam has spread all the way from northern Spain all the way to the Indus Valley. Now, if you're looking at an empire that is this big, an empire, in fact, that is almost perhaps bigger than Rome, it should be noted that there is a relative amount of diversity in this empire. To drive this point home, I've got a little video clip for you to watch and a question for you to answer. You'll see the question at the top of the screen.
Let's go to the thought bubble. So Islam is a universal religion that is supposed to transcend ethnic identity. According to the Quran, the believers indeed are brothers. The universal nature of Islam didn't mean that ethnicity didn't matter at all, of course. It did. Early on and for a long time, Arab ethnicity was privileged in the Islamic world, and this was especially true during the period of conquest. This was despite Muhammad saying, "Truly the Arab has no superiority over the non-Arab, nor the non-Arab over the Arab, nor the black over the white, nor the white over the black. except in piety. But their amazingly rapid and far-reaching conquest granted the Arabs huge prestige that lasted until the 18th century. Now, from the beginning, being a Muslim meant being part of a political community, because unlike Jesus or the Buddha, Muhammad was also a political leader in addition to being a religious one. But at least to an extent, the tight connection between political and religious identity really ended with the assassination of the fourth rightly guided caliph, Ali. According to the writer Tamim Ansari, after Ali's death, the caliphate was just an empire. But as the empire grew and became more diverse, it became impossible to hold it together as a political unit. So even though the idea of a caliphate doesn't square so well with Western notions of ethnically homogenous nation-states, ethnicity has always mattered in the Islamic world, as we can see if we go to Turkey or Egypt or Pakistan. In each of those places, the experience of being a Muslim is affected by the experience of one's ethnicity.
So, contrary to popular belief, especially in the West, the Islamic world turns out to be incredibly diverse, and ethnicities matter. Especially in the early days of the Islamic empires, being Arab puts you at a higher status in society than if you were non-Arab. However, as the video noted, the Quran says that the Arab has no superiority over the non-Arab, as long as everyone were believers. Now, that didn't necessarily take place in the Islamic empires, similar to various other social hierarchies that we have seen, and that shouldn't surprise us. But the Islamic world was incredibly diverse. That shouldn't surprise us either, because the Islamic empire spread so incredibly fast. It only took about 120 years for them to spread from this small nomadic people in the Arabian Peninsula all the way into Europe and all the way into the Indus Valley. Now, Islam's quick spread is the subject of several College Board questions. Now, you might see this question as it was asked of AP World students in 2015. The early spread of Islam outside of the Arabian Peninsula was caused primarily by... Now, any student taking this test usually boils it down to B, military conquests, or C, mercantile activity. Now, the hilarious thing about this one is that the College Board, in its progressive do-gooderism, actually says that military conquest is the answer. Now, I am here to refute that suggestion and say that really there was a kaleidoscope of reasons that Islam spread so quickly, one of which was military conquest for sure, but when they conquered people, they let them continue to practice their religions and their cultural practices, and therefore military conquest doesn't turn out to be a really good answer. It does not hold up to scrutiny. Rather, a better answer is mercantile activity, because the Muslims were very good at trading and their economic power spread very, very quickly as well. Saying that Islam spread because of military conquest allows people, particularly those in the West, practicing their own special type of Orientalism, allows them to argue that Islam, quote, spread by the sword. And that is not entirely true, especially when you take into consideration the vast economy that they had built. Nevertheless, we move on. So the next topic that we're going to discuss is the Abbasid rule over the Islamic world, which represents a golden age in the Islamic empires. This golden age is best exemplified by the emergence of Baghdad as an important city. So I have a video clip for you to watch on Baghdad and 3 important questions that you'll find at the top.
In only 2 centuries, Islam had extended its reach from Spain all the way to the edge of India. It took nearly a year to travel from one end of the Arab Empire to the other. At its heart was a fabled city of wealth. It was called Baghdad. The palaces of ancient Baghdad have been lost over the centuries, but in its glory, it rivaled ancient Athens or Rome. It was a magnificent architectural achievement, the pride of Islam in a new age. One visitor left this account. All the exquisite neighborhoods covered with parks, gardens, villas, and beautiful promenades are filled with bazaars and finely built mosques and baths. They stretch for miles on both sides of the glittering river. But what made this the greatest city of its time was more than just what met the eye. It was the company it kept. Scholars made Baghdad the jewel of the world.
Certainly from the 8th century on, Baghdad was the center of learning in the Islamic world, and all major innovations either came from Baghdad or quickly came to Baghdad because the best people came to Baghdad, the best thinkers, the best philosophers, the best artists.
They came in search of answers to pragmatic questions. The empire's meteoric growth had left its new leaders overwhelmed. They had staggering engineering and logistical problems to contend with. Solving them would take the greatest minds of the day.
Under the new empire now, you are responsible for public hygiene, you are responsible for the marketplace, you are responsible for goods being sold in the marketplace. All of those require some basic elementary sciences. This new civilization, having a need for science, really stems from the need to run that empire.
The best minds rose to the call. The finest were welcomed at a center of scholarship, Baghdad's renowned House of Wisdom.
It was a magnet for scholars and intellectuals who came and worked in the academies. There were public libraries associated with the palace, and scholars came from all over the empire. There were scholars from Iran, there were scholars from Byzantium who came. Some were Christians, some were Muslims, some were Jews. And all of these different sort of threads of human knowledge came together in the city of Baghdad.
So the net effect of this is that you've got human individuals from radically different cultural traditions being thrown into the same crucible.
The challenge that greeted these scholars was daunting. The great works of the ancients had to be transformed into a wholly new body of knowledge. Competition for jobs developed within a new intellectual elite.
And from there on, every single scientist is competing for that job. They were competing among themselves almost just in the same way that modern bureaucrats and modern academicians will fight among themselves.
Scholars were dispatched across the empire to locate as many ancient texts as possible. The first international scientific venture in history. Unlike their Christian counterparts, Muslim thinkers saw no insurmountable contradiction between their faith and the laws governing the natural world. So they embraced Aristotle and Plato, writers the Christian church considered blasphemous.
So this is the time when we begin to see scientists, bureaucrats, what have you, going and seeking from whatever civilization that had any sciences before, be it the Greek, be it the Indian, be it the Persian, and so on.
From the Hindus came mathematical concepts that guide us today. It was the scholars of the House of Wisdom who developed the system of Arabic numerals, still in use. It is they who translated and transformed the writings of the Greeks and made a gift of them to the modern Western world. The Renaissance had its beginnings in Baghdad.
They managed to assimilate quite a lot of the rich legacy of the Hellenistic world, translated into Arabic initially, which was then made available to all other participants in the new Islamic civilization. Arabic emerges as the language of learning throughout the region. This is a very significant development in human intellectual history.
Having amassed the knowledge, the Muslims now began to challenge it. This was perhaps their most important contribution. The scientific process was born.
They wanted to know why a very intelligent Greek scientist whose text they were just admiring and they were verifying it, why would he make a mistake in the first place? So they began to dig. Was it because he didn't have the right instruments, or is it because he didn't have the right methodology to use the instruments for the verifications of observation? It is this spirit. You see, the spirit of questioning, the spirit of saying that we have to build science constantly on a systematic, consistent basis where we make a physical proposition of how the universe ought to be run, and the mathematical representation of that physical universe ought to match. Now you begin to have what I call the birth of the new Islamic science.
Algebra and trigonometry, engineering and astronomy, countless disciplines integral to our lives today, trace their roots to Islamic scientists. More surprising, perhaps, were their innovations in medicine. At a time when Europeans were praying to the bones of their saints to cure their illnesses, Muslim physicians developed an innovative theory that disease was transmitted through tiny airborne organisms, the precursor to the study of germs. They determined that sick patients should be quarantined and then treated. This is the basis of the institution most fundamental to medicine today, the hospital. Funded mainly through religious endowments, Muslim hospitals had separate wards for patients suffering from different kinds of disease. Even mental illness was treated. Their studies of anatomy were so sophisticated that they remained in use by Muslim and European physicians for 600 years. Muslim scientists were especially intrigued by light, lenses, and the physiology of the human eye. The father of optics was a Muslim named Ibn al-Haytham. His work with lenses eventually led to the invention of the modern camera. He produced the first treatise that ventured to explain how the eye actually sees. A 1,000 years before the West dared to take up the practice, Muslim doctors were removing cataracts surgically, clearing them from the eye with a hollow needle. But for all this knowledge to transform and illuminate an empire, it had to be copied and shared across 100 different cities in the Islamic world. For this, there was a new invention, one that is still fundamental to learning and knowledge today: paper.
Around the year 700, 750, when Muslim armies reached Central Asia, they encountered paper for the first time. And very quickly, the Muslim bureaucracy started using paper. You find that, within 50 years, it's in Syria, and then a few years after that, it's in Egypt, and then it's in North Africa, and then it's in Sicily, and then it's in Spain. And that's where Europe learned to make paper from. They learned to make it from the Arabs.
We begin to have people with family names like papermaker. So in other words, not only that paper was available, it must have become a very, very widespread industry. And hence, the acquisition of books must have also become very easy.
With the wide use of books and paper, hundreds of scribes, some of whom were women, were kept busy transcribing the translations and new writings of the Baghdad scholars.
all of this knowledge that's being acquired from the Greeks and from the Indians and from Central Asian stuff is all being written down in books on paper, and that these books are being copied and recopied and sent around. We know, for example, that there was a street of booksellers with more than 100 shops, each one with paper and books for sale. And this is a time when, in Europe, a monastery would be lucky if it had 5 or 10 books.
While the monks of the West were hoarding their wisdom on scraps of expensive parchment, paper enabled Islamic civilization to spread its newfound knowledge far and wide, creating a single community linking 3 continents.
So the chief distinction, therefore, of Islamic civilization, in addition to the fact that it made new leaps of originality, new transformations in traditions of learning and everything else possible, is the fact that it enabled human beings to consider the possibility of thinking about the globe as a single unit, humanity.
In all the broad empire.
Okay, so hopefully you're able to answer the 3 questions at the top of the screen. If you weren't while it was going on, perhaps you want to pause me now and go ahead and answer those. The last one I think is the most profound. Can religion and science coexist? This is something that 2 things that in Christendom always had sort of a tenuous relationship. And I think what this video goes to show us is that in the Muslim world, it was a lot easier for these 2 things to get along, because Muslims tend to be more secure in their faith, whereas Christians tend to be a little bit more insecure, especially during this time period. Okay, so hopefully you were able to gather that Baghdad's influence was paramount to the Muslim world. It had this global library. The House of Wisdom was super important to the spread of culture and the spread of knowledge and the spread of ideas. The paper that they had acquired from the Chinese along the Silk Road routes became fundamental in creating libraries throughout the town. Medicine became one of the major things that they studied, and all of this contributed to Baghdad's population exploding. So by 900 AD, right at the beginning of the Abbasid rule, Baghdad is easily the biggest city that's not in the Chinese world. Okay, one of the most famous pictures from the time is of a Baghdad bookstore, and you can see that there are these scholars that are diving into the books. Remember, one of the greatest sayings ever: if you want to be smart, read the books. That's why the Islamic scholars during the Middle Ages were so intelligent. Now, it's important to note that the Islamic Empire is not monolithic, and therefore had several different entities that were all playing a role in its development over time. Now, the Abbasid Empire, while it did oversee much of what we consider as the Islamic world, on the fringes you see the development of different groups, because as we noted earlier, there was a significant amount of ethnic diversity. And as you got further to the outskirts, you got different people competing for power, and it was impossible for the Abbasids to really control the fringes of their empire, something similar to that of Alexander the Great, similar to Rome, similar to Persia. And so you see groups like the Mamluks or the Turks from Anatolia crop up to sort of challenge the Abbasids for power. Now, eventually the Abbasids are going to be conquered not by another Islamic faction, but by the Mongols, who are going to invade and sack Baghdad in the 1200s. But nevertheless, even within the Islamic world itself, you see competing factions for power. Now, you can note now that the Islamic world is invaded by Christians during the Crusades around between 1095 and 1300 CE, but that'll be a topic for a different day, so there's no need to belabor that now. In addition to invasions, you also see trade shifts as different invaders came in, as different political entities took power. You see the shifting of trading networks on the fringes to different areas involving different cities as time goes on. Now, Islamic rule went as far west as Spain. As we noted earlier, the Umayyads had conquered all the way to northern Spain, almost into France. They didn't make it that far for a reason we'll talk about in a second. But Cordoba was one of the jewels in the Islamic Empire. It is a fascinating city that has a lot to offer in terms of Islamic and Catholic history. One building of which is the Great Mosque at Cordoba. Currently, it's a Catholic cathedral. It's pictured in the back of the screen here. Perhaps you've seen it. If you've been to Spain, particularly to Cordoba, you can't miss it. It's probably the most important building in the area, but it's important to note it was a mosque. If you ever go and visit there, the Spanish are reluctant to tell you that, so it's something that you might want to ask them. In addition to this, the cultural effervescence that was around in Baghdad, it's also important to note that Muslim art, particularly calligraphy and particularly images and designs on textiles, were very popular throughout the empire. They were so popular, in fact, that Muslim art and Muslim textiles became centerpieces in famous Christian paintings. So if you'll see here, Mother Mary and her new child, she is adorning this headdress. Well, the headdress, as you can see, is adorned with Arabic writing. And the Arabic that is written there, correct me if I'm wrong, says there is one God, and that God is Allah. So even Christians took up Islamic textiles to make their paintings look nicer. Anyways, as you can see, architecture in the Islamic world was fascinating. It was intricate, beautiful. The mosaics were sights to be seen, and it was a high level of cultural achievement in the Islamic world. Now, the Great Mosque at Cordoba, the one that we just saw a bunch of pictures of, it took around 4 years for Muslims to build that mosque. If you compare that to some medieval cathedrals, some of which took 600 years to finish, that's pretty impressive. So the Islamic world, when put up against the Christian world, actually stands the test of time. Now, Muslims would have continued to expand had it not been for an influential battle, the Battle of Tours, fought between French kingdoms and Arabs, which eventually halted Islamic expansion. This should say Islamic, by the way. It halts Islamic expansion into Europe. So it's halting Islamic expansion into Europe. And the French leader of that battle is one Charles the Hammer Martel, pictured here. Handsome guy. Anyways, as a result of that, Muslims are only able to push as far north as Spain. And as you can see, compared to the spread of other religions, it is, by the time of its greatest spread, probably the most widespread religion. If you see right here, Islam is the predominant religion in Indonesia. That tells you that not only did it spread via Silk Road, not only did it spread via Mediterranean trade routes, but it also spread via Indian Ocean trade routes. Now, everywhere it spread, it tended to take cultural roots. For example, in Cordoba, many scholars chose to live out their days. So there's one particular Islamic scholar named Averroes, or he's better known as Ibn Rushd, who is well known for having mapped the human body. He wrote books on science. He was a well-known scholar in his day. Of all the places in the Islamic world that he could have lived, he chose Cordoba. Maimonides, who was a Jewish scholar, also chose Cordoba as his home. So Spanish culture, it was high-flying at this time. In terms of social classes, it's important to note that Muslims did organize their society hierarchically. While everybody was allowed to pray at mosque, if you were a non-Arab, your status in society depended upon whether or not you were a believer. So at the top of society would be an Arab who was born into the Muslim faith. Next would be an Arab who converts. Next would be a Muslim of non-Arab faith. And then you would have non-Arab, non-Muslims, slaves, immigrants towards the bottom. However, any slave or immigrant could improve their status if they converted to Islam, which is something that you don't necessarily see in the Christian world. Many slaves converted to Christianity in even North America as late as the 1800s, and that didn't do squat for them. As we noted, slavery was popular in the Islamic world. You wouldn't get those architectural feats if you didn't have slaves. However, like we said, if they converted, they were seen as people of the book, and therefore they were granted exalted status, sometimes even freed. Women also served as the role as slaves, usually in the form of concubines. Um, However, it's important to note that slavery did play a role in Islamic societies. Now, if you were not a concubine, if you were a free woman in the Islamic world, chances are that this was a better place for you to live than anywhere in Christendom. Now, despite the picture in the back of the screen of a woman in a burqa, which is this sort of standard picture that we in the West get of women in the Islamic world, women in the Islamic world actually vary in terms of what they wear and how they interpret scripture and their relationships with men. For the most part, women actually were treated better than they were in other places. Female infanticide under Muhammad and his successors was forbidden. The male's family would pay the bride's family a dowry to take her hand in marriage, and in many cases, women were educated. So, if we had to pick, this would be the place to be if you were a woman. There were harems, which were these places where women could get together and they could discuss scholarly topics. They could discuss topics of the day. They were relatively free in terms of being able to explore intellectual endeavors. Now, it's important to note, and you can see in the back of the screen there, not all women under Islam wear or look the same way. Usually, hijabs, which are these headdresses, were used to promote decency and modesty among women when they were in the presence of men that they were not familiar with. However, at home, they would not have to wear those. That's not something that you still see today. There are many countries that have banned this other form of dress, the burqa, one of which is Tunisia, which is an Islamic country. So you cannot say that all Islamic places treat women exactly the same way. Now, it's important to note that as time goes on, even Islam will change, and you see the emergence of different types of Islam. We've already talked about the Sunni Shia split, but this is a more updated form of Islam. It's sort of been described as students of mine as the chill Islam. Sufism. Sufism is a mystic form of Islam that sort of combines scripture with spirituality in a way that would probably look very foreign to the followers of Muhammad, however, has taken on a more progressive role. I have a short clip here to show you about it and questions that you can answer at the top of the screen.
India hosted its first ever World Sufi Forum. During the event, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi praised Sufism as Islam's greatest gift and suggested that the faith was an alternative to more political extremist interpretations of the religion akin to groups like the Islamic State. So, what exactly is Sufism? Well, Sufism is not a branch of Islam like Sunni or Shia, nor is it a sect or denomination. Rather, Sufism is the spiritual and mystical philosophy of Islam. It's focused on a direct connection to God by foregoing material goods and relationships. Not unlike Christian monks or other ascetic groups, Sufis dedicate themselves to Allah through meditation, repetitive prayer, and nonviolence. But while the concepts of Sufism are inherent in all versions of Islam, practitioners who wholly dedicate themselves to spirituality are called Sufis. Sufism arose less than a century after the founding of Islam. At the time, many Muslims were concerned with the religion's increasing materialism, which they believed would interfere with a spiritual connection with God. The word Sufi is an Arabic term for mystic, which itself was derived from suf, or wool. Sufis have historically worn wool as a rejection of worldly clothing. By about the 11th century, Sufism had adopted a system of fraternal groupings, called orders. In these spiritual schools, leaders taught their followers the principles and rituals of Sufism, which included writing books and poems and reciting hymns. In fact, the 13th century is known as the Golden Age of Sufism, as the greatest mystical Islamic art and literature is believed to have derived from this period. By the 16th century, Sufism was deeply ingrained in both Sunni and Shia Islam, and had spread throughout Persia, India, and Central Asia. The most well-known symbol of Sufism is the whirling dervishes, a Sufi order that originated in 14th century Turkey. It's known for its repetitive spinning dances that unite the follower with God, and is a popular tourist attraction in Turkey. Today, Sufis can still be found all around the world. But according to the Pew Research Center, the belief system is most common in sub-Saharan Africa, where about 35% of Muslims in the region are said to belong to a Sufi order. Sufism is also prevalent among Muslims in India, Thailand, and other Southeast Asian countries. Sufism has seen a resurgence in popularity as a direct alternative to the growing radicalization of Islam. Sufis have a legacy of philanthropy and missionary work, and are known for their nonviolence, tolerance, and personal sacrifice. During the Sufi Forum in India, Prime Minister Modi said, "At a time when the dark shadow of violence is becoming longer, you are the nur, or the light of hope." Modi reportedly hopes to make India the center of what he calls the World Sufi Movement, or the large-scale effort to use Sufism as a cure for jihadist extremism. World leaders have made similar efforts in the past in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, but whether the ascetic, nonviolent practices in Sufism can overcome the spread of radical Islam is yet to be seen. But even though Sufism has influenced both Sunni and Shia Islam, there is a huge rift between these two Islamic sects. Find out why by watching this video.
The Sunni-Shiite conflict.
All right. So that's all the time we have for today. I hope that you learned something about Islam and it has helped in aiding you into becoming a more egalitarian and enlightened person. That's all the time we have. This is your Buddha signing off.